Garrett Vanderbilt believed he owned the world, and for a man of his stature, it was an easy assumption to make. Tonight he stood on the marble terrace of his prized Malibu villa, a glass of vintage scotch in one hand, and his stunning new mistress Brielle in the other. He was about to unveil her to his inner circle, solidifying his new life in the very place he'd built his empire. But Garrett was about to learn a brutal lesson in ownership. He might have the deed, the staff, and the security codes, but he didn't have the most important thing, the keys. And the woman who held them, his forgotten ex-wife, was about to unlock his spectacular downfall. The villa was not a house. It was a statement, perched on a dramatic Malibu cliffside. The Aegean, as Garrett Vanderbilt had christened it, was a monument to his own genius. Its walls were glass, its floors Italian marble, and its infinity pool bled seamlessly into the vast indifferent blue of the Pacific Ocean. It was a structure designed to dominate the landscape, much like the man who owned it. Tonight, the Aegean was humming with the low thrum of expensive ambition. Garrett, a titan of private equity, with a jawline as sharp as his business acumen, surveyed his domain. He was a man forged in the crucible of hostile takeovers and billion-dollar deals, and he saw everything and everyone as an asset to be acquired and managed. His latest acquisition was Brielle Monet. Brielle was 24, a sun-kissed whirlwind of social media savvy and breathtaking beauty. She was everything his ex-wife Josephine was not. Where Josephine was quiet reserve, Brielle was vibrant noise. Where Josephine was classic literature, Brielle was a trending hashtag. She was a living, breathing testament to Garrett's post-divorce virility, a gleaming trophy to place on the mantle of his new life. Is it everything you imagined? Garrett's voice was a low purr, his arm possessively tight around her waist. He gestured with his scotch glass towards the setting sun, which was painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Brielle leaned into him, the silk of her emerald dress whispering against his tailored suit. It's more Gary. It's a dream. I can't believe this is your home. Our home, he corrected smoothly, the word tasting foreign and exciting on his tongue. For tonight, at least, I want everyone to see you here, to see us here. This party was not just a party, it was a coronation. Garrett had invited the board of Vanderbilt Equity, a handful of rival CEOs he wanted to intimidate, and a smattering of influential West Coast tastemakers. The message was clear. Garrett Vanderbilt was not diminished by his recent highly publicized divorce. He was reborn, upgraded, more powerful than ever. Brielle was the walking talking proof. She giggled a sound like wind chimes. They're all going to be so jealous. Let them be, Garrett said with a wolfish grin. Jealousy is just the price of admission to my world. He led her through the sprawling open-plan living area, pointing out the curated art on the walls, a Rothko here, a de Kooning there. He spoke of their monetary value, not their beauty. He showed her the climate-controlled wine cellar, boasting about a bottle of 1945 Romanée Conti he'd outbid a Russian oligarch for. Everything was a conquest. Brielle was suitably impressed, her eyes wide. She ran a hand over a cool granite countertop in the state-of-the-art kitchen. Did she decorate this place? The question was hesitant, a tiny crack in her perfect facade. Garrett's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Josephine, no. She had different tastes, more traditional. I had the entire place gutted and redesigned after she left. This is all me. Clean lines, no clutter, no history. He had made a point of erasing every trace of his 12-year marriage from the Aegean. He'd ripped out the rose garden Josephine had meticulously cultivated and replaced it with a minimalist Zen rock garden. He'd torn down the library she adored to make way for a high-tech screening room. He believed he had scrubbed her from the very foundations of the building. He was wrong. As the first guests began to arrive, their expensive cars winding up the long, cypress-lined driveway, a subtle change occurred in the house. A single, almost inaudible chime echoed through the integrated sound system, a sound Garrett didn't recognize. He dismissed it as a glitch. Then, as he was holding court with a tech mogul, regaling him with the story of acquiring the villa, the temperature in the room dropped by a few degrees. A sudden, inexplicable chill swept through the warm California air. Someone leave a door open, the mogul, a man named Kent, muttered, rubbing his arms. Garrett frowned, glancing at the massive glass panels, all sealed tight. Automated climate control. I'll have the staff check it. But he felt it too. A faint prickling sensation on his skin, a feeling of being watched. He scanned the growing crowd, the faces of his powerful friends and sycophants, and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Brielle was laughing with a fashion blogger, the perfect hostess in training. Everything was perfect, yet the feeling lingered. It was as if the house itself was sighing around him its new sterile identity, a poorly fitting suit over an older, more resolute frame. Garrett, a man who prided himself on controlling every variable, felt the first tiny tremor of an earthquake he couldn't see. He took a fortifying gulp of his scotch and pulled Brielle back to his side, her warmth a temporary shield against the encroaching cold. He was Garrett Vanderbilt. This was his villa. Nothing and no one could take that from him. The divorce had been surgical brutal, and in Garrett's opinion, exceedingly generous. He had given Josephine their sprawling estate in Connecticut a significant portion of his liquid assets and an alimony agreement that would ensure she never had to work again. He considered it a severance package. He was terminating her role as Mrs. Vanderbilt, and he was paying handsomely for a clean break. The one thing he had fought for, the one non-negotiable asset, was the Aegean. But why Garrett? Josephine had asked, her voice calm and measured in the sterile conference room of her lawyer's office. Her composure had always unnerved him. There were no tears, no histrionics, just a quiet, piercing intelligence in her grey eyes. You know what that land means to my family. It means you were land rich and cash poor, he had retorted, his voice sharp. I saved your family's legacy from crumbling into the sea. I bought that land fair and square from your father's estate when they were on the verge of bankruptcy. I built that masterpiece on it. It's a symbol of my success, not your family's decline. It was the truth, or at least his version of it. The Devereaux family had owned that stretch of Malibu coastline for generations. It had been a wild, untamed piece of land with a small weathered cottage where Josephine had spent her childhood summers. When her father passed away, leaving behind a mountain of debt, Garrett had swooped in. He saw it not as helping his in-laws, but as a strategic acquisition. He paid off their debts in exchange for the deed to the clifftop property. He bulldozed the old cottage and erased the Devereaux history to build his own. Josephine hadn't fought him on it. To his surprise, she and her lawyer, a formidable woman named Helen Cartwright, had conceded the point with very little argument. They had only asked for one small peculiar addendum to the property agreement within the divorce settlement, a moral conduct clause. His own lawyer, a bulldog named Peterson, had scoffed. It's unenforceable, archaic nonsense. The clause drafted by Cartwright was specific. It stipulated that the property, given its historical connection to the Devereaux family, should not be used in a manner that would bring public disrepute or scandal upon their name. It was vague, poetic, and as far as Garrett's legal team was concerned, utterly toothless. What constituted disrepute in modern-day Malibu? Let her have it, Garrett had instructed Peterson. It's a sentimental token, a way for her to feel like she didn't lose everything. It costs me nothing and makes her feel better. Sign it. He saw it as a pathetic attempt by Josephine to cling to a piece of her past. He underestimated her. He always had. He saw her quiet nature as weakness, her intelligence as a quaint hobby. He failed to understand that Josephine was an architect of a different kind. While he built empires of glass and steel, she built structures of patience and strategy. She knew him better than he knew himself. She knew his arrogance was not a character trait. It was a foundational flaw, a load-bearing wall just waiting for the right pressure to be applied. The moral conduct clause was not a sentimental token. It was a time bomb. Helen Cartwright had spent weeks researching obscure property laws and precedents, crafting a reversionary clause so intricate and ironclad that it was a work of legal art. The clause stipulated that in the event of a clear and public breach of moral conduct, as determined by an independent arbiter agreed upon in the settlement, the ownership of the property, including all fixtures and non-movable assets, would immediately revert to the last registered Devereaux heir, Josephine. Garrett had signed it without a second thought, his mind already on the redesigns, the parties, and the beautiful young women who would soon populate his coastal kingdom. He had handed Josephine the keys, not to the front door, but to his entire gilded cage. Josephine had spent the past year in silence. While Garrett's new life with Brielle was splashed across gossip sites, she was quietly setting the stage. She maintained contact with a few of the long-serving staff at the Aegean people who had been loyal to her family long before Garrett came along. She had the head of security, a man named George, on her payroll. He had been her father's head of security before he was Garrett's. His loyalty was never for sale. It was George who had, under the guise of a security upgrade, installed a new overriding control system for the villa's smart home technology, a system to which only he and Josephine had the master access codes. It was George who had discreetly placed micro cameras in the main entertainment areas, all feeding to a secure server. Josephine wasn't just planning to reclaim her property. She was planning to dismantle Garrett's reputation on the very stage he had built to glorify it. She had watched him flaunt his affair with Brielle, watched him boast about his new life in interviews, and felt nothing but a cold, calculated resolve. This wasn't about a broken heart. It was about justice. He had taken her family's land and desecrated its memory, turning it into a monument to his own ego and infidelity. Tonight, she was going to take it back. The party swelled a glittering tide of power and influence. Champagne flowed like water, and the air buzzed with the kind of high-stakes gossip that could move markets. Garrett was in his element, a king holding court. He moved through the crowd with Brielle on his arm, her presence a silent, stunning declaration of his victory. "Garrett, my boy," bellowed Robert Chen, a hedge fund manager with a booming voice and an insatiable appetite for risk. "I see you're trading up in all your assets. The girl's a rocket." He winked crudely at Brielle, who offered a practiced, dazzling smile. "Only blue-chip investments, Robert," Garrett replied smoothly, squeezing Brielle's hand. "High risk, high reward." The men laughed, and Brielle felt a familiar mix of exhilaration and unease. She was the prize, the topic of conversation, the beautiful object that signified Garrett's status. She loved the glamour, the reflected power, but a small part of her felt like an imposter in a borrowed dress. She caught sight of her reflection in one of the vast panes of glass and saw a stranger staring back, her smile a little too bright, her eyes a little too wide. The evening wore on, a symphony of clinking glasses and calculated compliments. Garrett decided it was time for the main event. He led Brielle to the center of the terrace, a designated hush falling over the crowd as a waiter handed him a microphone. "Friends, colleagues," he began, his voice amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system. "Welcome to the Aegean. Many of you know this has been a year of transition for me. Out with the old..." He paused for effect, and a few of his cronies chuckled knowingly. "And in with the new. I've rebuilt this home to reflect a new vision, a future built on strength, beauty, and forward momentum." He turned to Brielle, his eyes gleaming with proprietary pride. "And nothing represents that future more than the incredible woman by my side. I want you all to meet Brielle Monet." A polite, if slightly predatory round of applause rippled through the guests. Brielle blushed, a perfect picture of ingenue charm. This was her moment. She had arrived, and then it began. It started with the music. The sophisticated jazz trio that had been playing softly in the background was abruptly cut off. For a moment there was silence, and then a new sound filled the air. It was a woman's voice, clear and melancholic, singing an old folk ballad. It was a song Josephine's mother used to sing, a song about the sea reclaiming what it was owed. Garrett frowned, tapping the microphone. Technical difficulties, it seems. He motioned angrily to a staff member, who began frantically fiddling with the control panel. But the music continued swelling in volume. Then the lights began to flicker. The warm golden glow that bathed the terrace flickered and died, replaced by a cold, harsh white light that made everyone look pale and spectral. A murmur of confusion went through the crowd. Garrett's face, projected on the large screen behind him, that was meant to show a slideshow of the Aegean's beauty, was now a mask of thunderous fury. "What the hell is going on?" he hissed into the microphone, his voice echoing unnaturally around the terrace. The large screen behind him flickered. The curated images of the villa vanished. In their place, a new image appeared. It was a black and white photograph of a simple, weathered cottage, the very one he had demolished. Then another photo, a young girl with bright, intelligent eyes sitting on the porch of that cottage. It was a young Josephine. The guests gasped. This was not part of the presentation. The slideshow continued a visual narrative of the Devereux family's history on this land. Pictures of Josephine with her parents of family gatherings of a life that Garrett had tried to bury under tons of concrete and marble. The folk ballad swelled the mournful lyrics, now seeming like a chilling prophecy. Brielle stared at the screen, her smile frozen on her face. She saw the images of the woman who came before her, not as the frumpy, discarded wife Garrett had described, but as a young woman full of life, a woman with deep roots in the very ground beneath their feet. She felt a cold dread seep into her heart. Garrett was apoplectic, shouting at his security chief over his shoulder. "Cut the power, shut it down now." But nothing happened. The system was unresponsive. The house was no longer obeying its master. And then the final devastating blow. The sound system cut the music and a new voice filled the air. It was not singing. It was a calm, clear recorded voice. It was Josephine's voice. "Welcome, everyone," the voice said as if she were the host of the party. "You are all standing on Devereux Point, land that has been in my family for over a century, a place of memories of love and of integrity." The screen behind Garrett changed again, now displaying a high-resolution scan of a legal document. Words were highlighted in red. Moral conduct clause. Public disrepute. Reversion of title. "Garrett Vanderbilt was a guest here in my family's home," Josephine's voice continued, a chillingly calm narrator to his public execution. a guest who has overstayed his welcome and forgotten the terms of his lease. A lease not on the property, but on basic human decency. The massive steel security gates at the entrance of the long driveway began to slide shut, with a deafening groan trapping everyone inside. The lights in the villa began to shut down one section at a time, plunging the glittering party into an unnerving, encroaching darkness, until only a single cold spotlight remained illuminating Garrett Vanderbilt, standing alone and exposed in the center of his stolen kingdom. The spotlight pinned Garrett to the terrace, like a specimen under a microscope. His face, usually a confident mask of command, was contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The disembodied voice of his ex-wife had stripped him bare in front of the very people he sought to impress. The silence that followed her final words was heavier and more damning than any accusation. It was the sound of his world tilting on its axis. "This is a joke," Garrett finally choked out his voice hoarse. "A pathetic childish prank." He spun around, searching for the source of his humiliation. "Josephine, show yourself. You're finished. I'll sue you into oblivion." His threats echoed in the near darkness, impotent and desperate. His guests, moments before his fawning courtiers, were now a silent, staring jury. They were sharks who smelled blood in the water, their minds already calculating the fallout, the stock implications, the delicious gossip. Brielle had backed away from him, her face ashen. The emerald dress that had felt like a coronation gown now felt like a costume. She was an actor in a play she didn't understand, and the lead actress had just made a dramatic, unscripted entrance. She looked at Garrett not with adoration, but with the dawning horror of someone who has placed her faith in a false god. From the shadows near the entrance to the main house, a figure emerged. It was not Josephine. It was George, the head of security, a man Garrett had always regarded as little more than a piece of furniture. He walked calmly to the center of the terrace, his expression impassive. "Mr. Vanderbilt," George said, his voice steady and devoid of deference, "the property's security and automation systems are now under the control of the legal owner. I'm afraid your access has been revoked." "My access?" Garrett sputtered, taking a menacing step toward him. "You work for me, you idiot. I'll have you arrested for this." "My contract was with the property, sir," George replied without flinching, "not the occupant." Suddenly, the main doors of the villa slid open, casting a warm, inviting path of light from the interior. And in the doorway, silhouetted against the light, stood Josephine Devereaux. She was not dressed for a party. She wore simple, elegant linen trousers and a silk blouse, her hair pulled back neatly. She held no weapon, no legal documents, nothing but an air of absolute, unshakable authority. She looked directly at Garrett, her grey eyes holding no anger, no triumph, only a quiet, final judgment. "Hello, Garrett," she said, her voice, the same one they had just heard over the speakers, but now it was live, present, and utterly in control. "You seem to be having trouble with the house. Perhaps the owner should take a look." The word owner hung in the air, a guillotine blade ready to drop. Garrett stared at her, his mind struggling to process the reality of the situation. You can't do this. That clause, it's meaningless." "Is it?" A second figure appeared behind Josephine. It was her lawyer, Helen Cartwright, holding a tablet. "Mr. Vanderbilt, perhaps you'd like a refresher." "The clause you dismissed as sentimental was activated the moment you decided to use this property for the public flaunting of an affair, an act which, according to the pre-agreed independent arbiter, a retired appellate court judge, I might add, constitutes public disrepute to the Devereaux family name. The reversion of title was electronically filed with the county clerk's office 1 hour ago. This is no longer your house." Every word was a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. The legal precision, the retired judge, the pre-planned filing, it was a masterfully executed checkmate he had never seen coming. He turned his fury on Brielle, his last remaining symbol of power. You were a part of this," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at her. Brielle recoiled as if struck. "What? No, I didn't know anything." Josephine's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as she looked at the younger woman. "She's right, Garrett. She was just a prop for your ego, like this house, like I was. The difference is this house is mine." Josephine took a step forward, her presence commanding the space. She addressed the stunned guests, her voice calm and authoritative. "I apologize for the interruption. It seems there's been a change in management. As the rightful owner of the Aegean, I must ask you all to vacate the premises. The party is over." No one moved. The sheer audacity of it was paralyzing. Josephine nodded to George. "George, please escort our guests out. The main gate will open for 30 minutes. George and 2 other guardsmen loyal to him and not to Garrett's money began to move through the crowd politely but firmly, directing the stunned CEOs and socialites towards the exit. There was no protest, only a frantic, whispered exchange of information as they scurried away, eager to escape the blast radius of Garrett's spectacular implosion. In a matter of minutes, the terrace was empty, save for 3 people Garrett defeated and trembling with rage. Brielle, crying silently, her dream turned to a nightmare, and Josephine, the quiet queen who had just reclaimed her throne. "Get out of my house," Garrett whispered, the words rattling in his chest. Josephine simply looked at him. "No, Garrett," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "You get out of mine." The morning sun that streamed into Garrett's suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel felt like an indictment. It illuminated the wreckage of the night, an overturned tray of room service, a shattered scotch glass, and the rumpled, defeated figure of a king deposed. Garrett was a caged tiger pacing the plush carpet, his raw fury a palpable force in the room. This was his element, the aftermath of a battle, the marshalling of forces. He saw Josephine's move not as a final checkmate, but as an audacious, foolish opening salvo in a war she could not possibly win. He was about to bring the full crushing weight of his empire down upon her. His lead counsel, Bill Peterson, and 2 junior associates were patched in on a large screen, their faces a tense triptych of legal anxiety. Peterson, a man whose reputation was built on ruthless litigation, looked unusually grim. "Bill, I want a TRO filed by noon," Garrett commanded, his voice a low growl. "I want liens on every asset she has. I want her name, her lawyer's name, dragged through so much mud they'll be radioactive. Find dirt on this arbiter she used, this Monroe. Everyone has a price, everyone has a skeleton. Dig it up. This ends now." Peterson held up a hand, a gesture that years of working with Garrett had taught him was a risk. "Gary, we need to slow down. The team has been dissecting the divorce settlement since 3 a.m. The news isn't good." "Not good." Garrett laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "I pay you 8 figures a year to make the news good. This is a joke clause. It's a moral conduct provision. It's unenforceable, subjective fluff. No court in the country would uphold it." "A court didn't have to," Peterson said, his voice flat. "The arbiter did. And by the terms of the settlement agreement we drafted and you signed, his decision is legally binding and non-appealable. We waived the right to a court hearing on this specific matter." Garrett froze mid-pace, the blood draining from his face. "We what?" "It was a concession," Peterson explained, his tone betraying his own frustration. "We wanted the house clear and simple. Cartwright's team offered to concede it without a fight in exchange for 2 things, the moral conduct clause and the binding arbitration clause to enforce it. We saw it as a throwaway to expedite the settlement. We advised you it was trivial." "It was a Trojan horse," Garrett whispered, the sheer calculated genius of the trap beginning to dawn on him. "It was a legal masterpiece," Peterson corrected, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. "Helen Cartwright didn't just find a loophole. She built an entire self-contained legal ecosystem around it. While you were planning your party, she was building your cage." One of the junior associates cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, we've done a deep dive on the arbiter, retired Judge Alistair Monroe." "And," Garrett snapped, "what's his weakness?" "He doesn't appear to have one," the associate stammered. "He spent 30 years on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. He's famous for it. They called him the contract saint. He wrote the literal textbook on contractual ethics and obligations that's used in law schools across the country. He has a reputation for being completely incorruptible and for having an almost religious reverence for the literal written word of an agreement." Peterson cut in. "We didn't just agree to an arbiter, Gary. We agreed to the one man in the American legal system predisposed to see this clause not as sentimental fluff, but as a sacred pact. The walls of the hotel suite seemed to be closing in." "So what did she prove, that I have a girlfriend? This is Malibu, not a monastery." "She proved it with your own words and your own systems," Peterson said, the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening finality. Cartwright's petition to the judge included a comprehensive file. Time-stamped security footage from the villa, footage from the system your man George controlled of you and Ms. Monet in compromising situations. Transcripts of your speech at the party where you publicly dismissed your marriage as the old and flaunted Ms. Monet as the new. She even included a dozen sworn affidavits from the catering staff who overheard your more colourful boasts. You didn't just breach the clause, Garrett. You took a blowtorch to it, in public, on the property in question. You handed them the perfect case on a silver platter. Across town, in a serene sunlit office in Century City, the atmosphere was one of quiet completion. Josephine Devereaux sipped a cup of tea, while Helen Cartwright coolly archived the stream of frantic, threatening emails coming from Peterson's firm. They're threatening to sue for tortious interference, fraud, emotional distress. It's quite a list, Helen noted with the calm amusement of a player who has already won the game. They're just firing cannons into the dark, Josephine replied, her composure absolute. We operated entirely within the four corners of the document. Let them spend millions making noise. It won't change the outcome. The true devastating scope of Josephine's plan went beyond just reclaiming the land. It was about the assets. Helen pulled up a subclause on her tablet, one buried deep within the property section of the settlement. The fixtures and non-movable assets provision, Helen said, smiling faintly. Garrett was so focused on the land deed, he never paid attention to the definitions. He never reads the fine print, Josephine said. He considers it beneath him. Well, this fine print is about to cost him dearly, Helen continued. By legal definition, a fixture is anything physically attached to the property in such a way that its removal would cause damage. We're not just talking about cabinets and light fittings, we're talking about the entire integrated smart home network, the custom-built temperature-controlled wine racks in the cellar, the multi-million-dollar security grid, the professional-grade kitchen appliances, even, and this is my personal favorite, any piece of art that is physically bolted or secured to a wall. Josephine thought of the massive de Kooning painting, the centerpiece of Garrett's collection, which he'd had mounted with a museum-grade security frame drilled directly into the load-bearing wall of the main living area. He had done it to protect his asset from theft, but in doing so, he had legally made it a part of the house, a part of her house. The phone on Garrett's hotel desk buzzed. It was Peterson again. His face on the screen was pale, defeated. The art bill, Garrett said, his voice a low, desperate plea. The renovations, the furniture. I poured over $50 million into that place. She can't keep that. That's grand larceny. It's not larceny, Garrett. Peterson's voice was weary, stripped of all its bluster. It's that fixtures clause. The de Kooning is hers. The sound system is hers. The entire $500,000 kitchen setup is hers. Anything you can't pick up and carry out without a toolbox legally conveyed with the property. There was a long, heavy pause. I've never seen anything like it. It's the most perfectly constructed, utterly brutal contract I've ever encountered. This is theft. Garrett roared, slamming his fist on the table, the sound barely registering. Peterson's voice was almost a whisper. No, Garrett. It's your signature. Garrett sank into a chair, the phone slipping from his grasp. The fight was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying vacuum. He was a man who had moved mountains with his wealth and bent the world to his will with his power. But he had been defeated. Not by a rival corporation, not by a market crash, but by a few paragraphs of text on a piece of paper he had been too arrogant to read. He was trapped, and the bitterest irony of all was that he himself had forged the bars. The fallout was not a slow decline, it was a detonation. For Garrett Vanderbilt, the morning after his public dethroning was a brutal assault on all fronts. Holed up in the sterile luxury of a hotel suite that felt more like a prison, he watched his life's work, the meticulous construction of his own myth, burn on the pyre of public opinion. Every news channel, every financial blog, every gossip site was leading with his story. The headlines were a series of devastating blows. Vanderbilt's Vanity Fair billionaire blindsided by ex-wife's legal coup market. Shudders as Vanderbilt equity CEO's judgment questioned the ultimate power play, how Josephine Devereaux reclaimed her kingdom. The narrative was set, and he was its villain, a modern-day Icarus, whose wings of arrogance had melted in the Malibu sun. His phone was a conduit for the escalating crisis. An emergency conference call with the board of Vanderbilt Equity was a gallery of cold, unforgiving faces on a screen. We have to talk about the optics, Garrett said, Lawrence Schmidt, the board's chairman, his voice devoid of its usual collegial warmth. Optics. Garrett shot back, his voice ragged from sleeplessness and rage. This wasn't a business misstep, Lawrence. This was a personal, vindictive attack. The markets don't differentiate, Schmidt retorted, his tone like ice chipping away at stone. They see a leader who was so blinded by his own narrative that he missed a contract clause that cost him a 9-figure asset. They see instability. Our stock is down 7% in pre-market trading. This isn't just personal anymore. He was adrift, abandoned by the sycophants who had surrounded him. His world was built on the perception of strength, and that perception had been irrevocably shattered. In his fury and confusion, he turned on the most convenient target. His first and only call to Brielle was brutal and short. She answered on the first ring, her voice a mix of fear and concern. Gary, what's happening? Are you okay? Stay away from me. He snarled, the words dripping with venom. I don't know what your role in this was, but it's over. You're done. He hung up before she could respond, severing the connection with a final cruel click. In his paranoia, he couldn't conceive that he alone was the architect of his downfall. Someone else had to be complicit, and she was the easiest to blame. For Brielle, that click was the sound of her world ending. She had been escorted from the property the night before like any other guest left standing on the Pacific Coast Highway in a silk gown that suddenly felt cheap, waiting for an Uber. The ride back to the city had been silent, the driver occasionally glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his expression a mixture of pity and curiosity. The next morning, the true nature of her situation became terrifyingly clear. The key fob to the penthouse apartment he rented for her was deactivated. Her credit cards, all linked to an account Garrett controlled, were declined when she tried to buy a coffee. The influencers who had eagerly posed for selfies with her at the party now left her messages on read. She was a ghost erased from a life she had only just begun to inhabit. She sat on a park bench, the declined credit card still clutched in her hand, the humiliation, a burning sickness in her stomach. The illusion that had sustained her, that her beauty was a form of power, that her association with Garrett gave her value, crumbled into dust. She saw with hideous clarity that she had never been a queen in waiting. She was a decoration, a beautiful lamp he had acquired to brighten a room, and now that he had left the room, the lamp had been unplugged and discarded. The bitterness she felt was aimed not just at Garrett, but at her own willful blindness. She had traded her autonomy for a gilded cage, and the door had just been slammed shut. Garrett, meanwhile, descended deeper into a self-imposed exile of fury. He lashed out at his lawyers, his PR team, anyone who tried to offer rational advice. He saw conspiracies in every corner, convinced Josephine had orchestrated a grand campaign to turn his world against him. He failed to grasp the simpler, more devastating truth: Josephine hadn't needed to build a conspiracy. She had merely kicked the rotten pillar of his own hubris, and the entire structure had come crashing down on its own. He had built his empire on fear and intimidation, not loyalty. When he stumbled, there was no one waiting to catch him, only rivals and onlookers eager to scavenge the wreckage. Then, a week after the party, the final elegant blow was struck. It came not in the form of a lawsuit or a market downturn, but on the glossy pages of Global Architect Digest. The feature was titled, "Devereaux Point, a Legacy Reclaimed." The article was a masterpiece of narrative control. Josephine, photographed in the warm light of the restored library, spoke not a single word about her divorce or Garrett. Instead, she spoke with passion and eloquence about her family's century-long history on the land. She detailed her vision for the Aegean's future, not as a private residence, but as a non-profit foundation. "This land has always been a source of inspiration," she was quoted as saying, her voice in print as calm and measured as it was in person. "My goal is to restore that spirit. We are stripping away the cold, impersonal surfaces and creating a space that fosters creativity and thought. The Devereaux Point Foundation will be a haven for artists, writers, and scientists, a place to build, not just to own." The article painted her as a graceful visionary, a philanthropist, rescuing a piece of California's soul from the clutches of commercialism. Without ever mentioning his name, she had perfectly framed Garrett as the vulgar antagonist in her story of noble reclamation. He was the man who had tried to pave paradise. She was the one planting the garden. Reading the article on his tablet in the suffocating quiet of his hotel room, Garrett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He had lost the house, the money, the power. But this was different. This was the final indelible defeat. Josephine had not only taken his castle, she had rewritten its history, erased his name from its walls, and consecrated it to a purpose so unimpeachable it made him look petty and small by comparison. He hadn't just lost the war, he had lost the story, and he knew with a certainty that felt like death that he would never get it back. Months bled into a year. The seasons on the Malibu coast turned, the relentless sun softening into the gentle gold of autumn, then sharpening with the crisp chill of winter winds. The scandal that had once roared like a wildfire was now a bed of cooling embers, its heat and light fading from the insatiable 24-hour news cycle. Garrett Vanderbilt was old news, a ghost haunting the archives of gossip websites. He had survived, but only just, after a brutal soul-bearing proxy battle that cost him a significant portion of his remaining fortune, and the last vestiges of his pride. He managed to cling to his title as CEO. Yet, the title was a hollow thing. He was a king in a shrunken kingdom. The swagger that had defined him was gone, calcified into a brittle defensive shell. He moved through his new smaller office, a clear demotion from his former penthouse suite, with the haunted energy of a man perpetually looking over his shoulder. He saw betrayal in every shadow and conspiracy in every whispered conversation. The man who once commanded rooms with his presence now seemed to shrink from them. He told himself he didn't care about the Aegean, that it was a tainted asset he was better off without. But he lied. Late at night, fueled by scotch, that no longer tasted of victory, he would find himself scrolling through articles about the Devereux Point Foundation. He saw pictures of the villa, his villa transformed. The cold, sterile white walls were now warmed by vibrant paintings. The minimalist rock garden he'd installed as a monument to his control was gone, replaced by a riotously beautiful garden overflowing with the very roses he'd ordered ripped from the earth. Each image was a fresh torment, a testament to a world that was not only surviving without him, but thriving in his absence. At the Aegean, the atmosphere was one of quiet, joyful industry. The silence of the house was no longer the sterile hush of a museum, but the peaceful quiet of deep concentration, punctuated by the murmur of conversation from the library or the distant notes of a piano from the main salon. The air smelled of salt, blooming jasmine, and faintly of turpentine and linseed oil from the studio of a painter in residence. Josephine moved through these spaces not as a conqueror on her throne, but as a thoughtful gardener tending her soil. She had found a purpose that resonated far deeper than retribution. She took coffee with a young novelist, struggling with his second act, offering not literary advice, but quiet encouragement. She listened as a biochemist there on a sabbatical excitedly explained a potential breakthrough, her ideas flourishing in an environment free from corporate pressure. This was the soul she had given back to the house, the soul of creation. One crisp afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, the return address unfamiliar. Inside, the handwriting was neat, precise, yet bore the faint tremor of nerves. Josephine read it standing by the large glass window overlooking the Pacific. Ms. Devereux, it began. You don't know me, not really, but I was the woman with Garrett Vanderbilt that night. My name is Brielle Monet. I'm writing to you not to ask for forgiveness because I'm not sure what I'd be asking forgiveness for other than my own profound blindness. I allowed myself to be a symbol, a prop in a story he was writing about himself. When that story ended, so did I. I have spent the last year trying to figure out who is left. I'm not writing for pity. I'm writing because I saw an article about what you've done with the house with Devereux Point. You didn't just take it back. You gave it a purpose beyond vanity. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something like hope. The raw honesty of the letter struck Josephine. She saw not the mistress, the rival, but a young woman who had been collateral damage in a war she hadn't known was being fought. She saw a reflection, however faint, of her own past self, a woman whose identity had been defined by Garrett Vanderbilt. Josephine folded the letter and after a moment's thought walked to her desk to write a reply. A week later, a modest sedan wound its way down the cypress-lined driveway. Brielle stepped out, her movements hesitant. She was dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, her face free of the heavy makeup she once wore like armor. The dazzling camera-ready smile was gone, replaced by a look of vulnerable sincerity. Her eyes scanned the transformed home, a place that represented both her highest ambition and her deepest humiliation. Josephine met her on the path, extending a hand. Brielle, I'm glad you came. Thank you for seeing me, Brielle said, her voice barely above a whisper. This place, it feels different. It feels alive. It's breathing again, Josephine agreed, leading her toward the garden. They walked in silence for a few moments, the only sound the crunch of gravel under their feet and the distant cry of gulls. It was Brielle who spoke first. I needed to tell you. I'm sorry, not for him, but for my part in the disrespect shown to this place, to your family's memory. I never understood. You weren't meant to, Josephine said, her voice gentle, devoid of judgment. Garrett's world is built on surfaces, not foundations. It's easy to get lost in the reflection. She paused, turning to face the younger woman. I believe people deserve a chance to rewrite their own stories. I had to rewrite mine. It seems you are too. Tears welled in Brielle's eyes, tears of relief and recognition. This was an empathy she had never expected. I am, but I don't know where to start. Garrett was so focused on erasing the past, Josephine mused, looking toward the old familiar coastline. I find it's more productive to build upon it, to acknowledge it, learn from it, and then lay a new stone. An idea nascent since she'd first read about the foundation crystallized in Brielle's mind. I know social media. I know marketing. It's what I did. I know how to tell a story online, a real one. I could help you. For the foundation, pro bono. I want to use what I know for something that matters. Josephine studied her, seeing the genuine desire to contribute to build instead of simply being displayed. She saw not a former rival, but a potential ally, another woman seeking to reclaim her own narrative. I think, Josephine said with a small, genuine smile, that would be a wonderful place to start. Later that evening, long after Brielle had departed with a renewed sense of purpose, Josephine stood alone on the terrace. The setting sun cast a warm, benevolent glow across the land. From an open window behind her, she could hear the young poet from the residency program reading his new work aloud to a small, appreciative audience of his peers. The scent of salt and roses filled the air. This was her victory. It was not the hollow thrill of Garrett's defeat, a moment that had passed as quickly as it came. Her victory was this enduring peace. It was the quiet hum of creativity, the earnest conversation with a young woman finding her footing, and the resilient strength of the land beneath her feet. She had not just taken back the keys to a villa, she had unlocked her own legacy. A legacy built not of glass and steel, but of grace, resilience, and the quiet, profound triumph of making something beautiful in a place that had been broken. The house was finally and truly home. So what happens when blinding arrogance collides with quiet, calculated intelligence? The story of Garrett Vanderbilt and Josephine Devereaux is more than just a tale of a billionaire's downfall. It's a powerful reminder that true ownership isn't about deeds, money, or power. It's about understanding respect and the unbreakable bonds of history. Garrett thought he was erasing the past, but he had merely built his glass house on top of a foundation he never bothered to inspect. Josephine taught him, and all of us, that the most dangerous person is the one you underestimate. She didn't just reclaim a house, she reclaimed her story, proving that the most satisfying victories aren't loud and explosive, but silent, strategic, and absolute. What would you have done in Josephine's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. If you were captivated by this story of intricate justice, don't forget to hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a good story and subscribe to our channel for more tales of when the underestimated finally get their day.